Let's shift our focus now from harnessing data to turning data into a decisive edge, how AI developers and intelligence analysts can drive best fit future tech. Joining me, Nick Bousquet, Director of Geospatial Intelligence Solutions for the Leidos Intelligence Group. Nick, great to see you, sir.
Thanks, George. Thanks for having me.
And Ravi Boudou, Chief Software Architect and Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning Lead for their National Solutions Operation. Ravi, great to have you, sir.
Hey, good to be here, George.
So set the table for me, gentlemen. Nick, I'll start with you. What is the current state of automation, of AI technologies, particularly for the IC, the intelligence community?
Yeah, George, I think that's a great starting point. So I'd say AI and automation in general has taken hold at varying levels at different disciplines and at different agencies currently. Some, like NGA, a much beloved customer of mine, have embraced tradecraft automation for a long time. They've been using things like computer vision, but you look at other places in the IC and DoD, and there's been some slower adoption rates. I think the interesting aspect here, though, is that even where it has been a part of the enterprise for some time, adoption rates and trust have been decidedly slow, regardless of if it's already been injected into their environment. So two modern paradigm shifts, I believe, would be the catalyst for increased automation adoption. Would be the first, which is just this undeniable deluge of data we're experiencing. In the military, we have a term, LIM factor, limiting factor. The limiting factor historically for us was always access to enough information to solve our problems. Whereas now the issue is more akin to trying to locate the right data out of piles of available data, and then eventually being able to parse it in a meaningful manner. The second is a combination of two things. It's COVID actually, and the commercial market. Commercial technology is increasingly closing the gap, or it has often surpassed what the IC and DoD have historically utilized. And so as such, it's kind of vital that we look to the external for best practices in the commercial world, where they've already embraced techs like this as just a manner of normal practice. And they're not necessarily indoctrinated into the tradecraft world. Many of us, myself included, have been. And so they possess this unique perspective that assumes the incorporation of automation from the get-go. And COVID is a part of this, as I mentioned as well, because it's somewhat normalized working from non-traditional locations and by proxy, an adoption of the TTPs or the tradecraft that would go along with that.
Yeah, and then from like a technical perspective, we've seen the adoption of AI really been driven by like the increases in computer power and then decreases in the cost of that power. And of course, like Nick said, just the explosion of data that's coming out of all of these sensors from the commercial world, from the intelligence community world, and others. So you've kind of seen an evolution of AI move from kind of rules-based kind of machine learning to your basic type of pixel processing, now all the way out to deep learning with neural networks with billions of parameters and multimodal models. And kind of the latest and greatest thing is coming out now are kind of these self-supervised algorithms where you don't really even need a human in the loop to label your data going into a machine learning algorithm. And then once you've got all this stuff running, kind of the next step is, like your sense making and your analytic processes, that higher level of thinking just from, identifying objects in an image or in certain signals. So today, we can find artificial intelligence, identifying, F-15s at aircraft base or surface to air missiles at some sort of military facility. It can analyze signals. It can find patterns in economic data, do alerting, forecasting, and now we're trying to see things where it's doing like event prediction and automatically writing analyst reports that can get quality control and then distributed to various stakeholders. But what you really need to start thinking about now is that, what are those disruptive technologies? So the IC community is kind of increasing, their data scientists, their AI/ML experts, and, people beyond just kind of your day-to-day, imagery or signals processing analysts or human analysts. So how do you actually leverage that collective knowledge to start thinking about what's those next technological innovations that are relative to the intelligence mission?
Ravi, if I could stay with you for a moment, software developer is part of the hat or the portfolio that you wear for Leidos. Nick mentioned trust. One focal point for the IC is human machine biases. How can developers in particular work with analysts to limit the risk there of these biases?
Yeah, we see that in the commercial world too, right? Where a lot of these machine learning algorithms have been trained up, and you've seen them, obviously be biased in terms of, gender and race and things like that. And kind of the same, ideas apply to the IC space as well. So there's a few things that can help unbias the systems. One is what we're calling trusted AI. So how do you establish trust in what's coming out of these algorithms? In the past, these algorithms have been made by, developers in a software factory, and they get delivered to analysts in a black box. And the analyst runs it, a result comes out. And then how do you actually know whether or not that result is to be trusted? How did the machine actually come up with that? So what we're seeing now is a big push in the AI ML community for what's called like explainability models and transparency when it comes to how these machine learning models are developed. So what you want to do is, be able to detect when models are being spoofed, let's say, or drifting off their normal parameters, and being very transparent in that whole process for the analysts. They can see what data went in to feeding a model, what processing pipelines went in and train the model, and what the actual data that the model used to come up with its answer. And, more and more that data is becoming, less scientific, and it's being more consumable by your end analysts, and through visualizations and dashboards and stuff, they can see how that's working and then make the appropriate adjustments to minimize that kind of bias. So that's definitely an area of concern for sure when it comes to machine learning algorithms and AI, but there's ways that the community is working together to combat that.
So Nick, Ravi mentions explainability models. You used a term earlier that I have not heard before, so forgive my ignorance here, but computer vision, are those two related to one another, explainability models and computer vision?
Yeah, George, absolutely. So computer vision is a subset of the AI/ML category that deals specifically with exactly what you think, computers trying to decipher visual information and derive outcomes from that. Explainability models have to be inherent to that, as well, as Ravi pointed out, to understand exactly how the algorithm got to the current state that it's in. So that transparency that he's been talking about is one of the most important things to really develop that analytic workforce trust. One of the really interesting things here is that we have to deal with what I'd say is a bit of a paradox I've noticed while working on mission and with users in this domain. And that's that we have a little bit of an acceptance threshold of difference for AI errors versus that of human errors. There's a deep intolerance of risk associated with AI/ML applications. We seek perfection, though we accept imperfection on the human analytical spectrum. It's assumed that we're going to be imperfect. So to many, a 20% human error rate may be more acceptable than a 5% machine error rate. And I think there's some credibility to that when you talk about peripheral intelligence, context being missed. But there's also some things that we need to talk about in terms of how those biases where they stem from, and how we can counter them, and whether or not they're even legitimate, and as we look at AI incorporation as a whole.
I'm going to get a little philosophical here, Ravi, so bear with me. But Nick mentions this bias against artificial intelligence, particularly in this area of error rates. These are big cultural issues for the intelligence community. So let's kind of tie that point to workforce. I don't have to tell you, some IC organizations farther along than others as far as adoption of AI strategies, AI solutions. For the organizations leading that charge, how is AI changing the way they think about the workforce? What steps have they taken to overcome some of those hurdles, some of those biases?
Yeah, so I've been kind of developing machine learning algorithms and things like that for 20 years. So I've kind of seen the transition from the workflows not using any sort of automation tools at all because they just don't trust it, just rather want to do things the way they've always done them, to now migrating a lot more into trusting what's coming out from a lot of these technological innovations in the AI/ML space. So one thing you're seeing too that's helping to catalyze that is a younger workforce, right? We've seen a lot more analysts come in that have been raised within an environment that where, assisted technology is just part of their life, right? You got your Siri devices, your Alexas, your Googles, they're just there to assist you. They're kind of used to things, working sometimes, but, not working other times as well. You correct it, right? And things are learning over time, but in the grand scheme of things, they're kind of helping you at the end of the day. So that's one thing. The second thing is analysts doing, less time doing the rote work. Instead of just identifying objects in an image or just looking at endless amounts of video over like hours and hours, you're seeing the workflows kind of move up the value chain. So what does that actually mean? That means they can start doing things that humans do best, right? Leave that rote work to the machine, and the humans are doing more collaboration with other humans, right? They're analyzing the patterns, they're making quick decisions, they're like looking at things from a holistic way, and leaving all of that, things that the machines are good at to the machines. So you're thinking more about how is your workforce moving away from your day-to-day analysts into data scientists and a data-centric workforce that's doing more of that higher level analysis and adding more value to the tasks that they're doing on a mission basis.
Yeah, I'd love to just kind of tail off of what Ravi's saying here. So when you think about how an organization thinks about their workforce, AI adoption, the first thing I'd actually like to really set the stage for out of the two is what we shouldn't do. And I think what we shouldn't do is think of AI as a threat to the existing workforce. There's a little bit of this modern John Henry man versus machine context that bounds the conversation that I think is just inherently the wrong way of looking at things. AI is a tool to assist analysts like many others, and arguably will increase the need for analytical roles rather than decrease them. Like Ravi said, we have these conversations about freeing up the human cognitive elements, vice doing the rote work. I could not believe in that anymore. I think that's absolutely dead on. We're going to be deriving tips and clues from larger and larger amounts of data that require that cognitive assistance to contextualize reports. And we see that decrease in the rote tasks. So that's a really great thing. And that's not to say that there won't be changes. There absolutely will be. An increase in data science and adjacent fields will be totally necessary, as will a baseline understanding of technology. For many of the traditional analytic roles, we may see a lot of traditional analysts that were all source or imagery analysts learn basics of Python coding, learn the basics of data science. And the thing that's most often overlooked, I think, are some of these really beautiful skill sets that are developing now that are in between the hard and soft skill areas. I'm talking about things in the vein of human-centered design, analytic methodology, people that will be the necessary liaisons between technical developers and other areas. And I think that's just going to be absolutely vital.
Yeah, the human-centered design aspect of things is huge now. You're seeing teams in the IC that have programmers and developers embedded in those teams, right? So they can see how those analysts are working day to day and make the AI, ML, and the technological innovations kind of unobtrusive and kind of transparent to the users. So they can be doing their job the way that they've always done it, but in the background, those algorithms are kicking off and doing all those types of back-end processes in order to make their life easier down the road. And you're finding systems where, analysts don't even know they're training a machine learning algorithm, or, they don't know that they're actually, those inputs are going into building up an analytic model. But you're also presenting to them that information in a way that's consumable so they can utilize it in the future, right? They say, hey, because that you're doing your work the way you've always done it, here's some other recommendations like technology and other types of data you might be interested based on what you've been doing that you can apply to your job in the future.
Nick, the workforce challenges that you and Ravi point out, these are generational challenges. What are some others that maybe, an intelligence community agency can get a quick win?
Yeah, so I think what you're going to hear, or what you probably have heard echoed throughout this conversation, is the element of trust, embracing the workforce, taking AI out of a black box, providing transparency into the evolution of algorithms, and making, most importantly, probably making analyst stakeholders in the actual evolution of this. The mix of the hard and soft skill roles was also another huge important aspect. But I think, one of the biggest things we can do is first and foremost, be smart about where we apply automation. We need to be honest about the somewhat niche applications that work best and exercise those options. Order of battle detection, social media message traffic scrubbing, key alerting, the rote stuff we talked about. Where it becomes a lot more difficult are the higher minded ideas around complex models and predictive analytics. Not only because the models themselves are inherently more complex, but also when you entrust a machine, at least right now, to take in entire scenes, they may miss vital context on the periphery of the mission that could redefine the entire scope. So be smart about insertion, because every time that we overpromise and underdeliver, we take 10 steps backwards. And trying to recover that ground is just really a very big issue.
So Ravi, as you work with agencies across government at doing just that, at applying automation, how do you advise those senior leaders in IT about where to apply it? What projects make sense? What projects don't make sense?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges there is just trying to keep pace with innovation, right? So it seems like every other week there's something new that's come out within this space, and it's the question is, is it relevant? Is it useful? Can we trust it? How well is it working, and where do we apply it? So keeping pace with innovation is definitely one of the challenges. Trying to place certain types of technology where they work best is kind of what Nick touched on as well, right? It's that human interaction. It's actually going out and talking to the end users of that data, saying, hey, where can we apply this technology to you? What are your pain points? Where can we automate your workflow? And then working that way, instead of going to the user and trying to shove something down their throats and saying, use this as a new tool, and they're constantly have 20 tools on their desktop they're trying to move between. I don't think that's the way to do it. It's really kind of reaching out and talking to the workforce and saying, hey, what are those quick wins initially that we can give you through technology? And then how we build upon that to, make your life easier, to make you more efficient, and make sure that, all those stakeholders involved get what they want at the end of the day. So what does that mean? I mean, it's like I mentioned, embedding developers in the analyst teams is one thing. Democratizing AI ML, right? So making technologies and libraries available within the entire community, move away from silos and proprietary models, and then really kind of embracing that kind of open source data sharing mentality. And how do we actually use our collective knowledge together to break down some of these limitations?
If you're joining our session late, where have you been? I mean, really, guys. No, just kidding. This will be available on demand after the fact, so you can catch up. I'm talking to Nick Bousquet, Director of Geospatial Intelligence Solutions for the Leidos Intelligence Group, and Ravi Boudou, Chief Software Architect and AI and Machine Learning Lead for their National Solutions Operation. Nick, marry two worlds for me that don't make perfect sense. Earlier, you mentioned this deluge of data that organizations are being hit with, but also increases in computer power that allow them to do more with that data. That seems like a balance that organizations have to strike. Do you have any best practices there on maximizing that new computer power, but also either limiting or doing a better job of being stewards of data as more and more of it comes in?
Yeah, George, that's a great question. So it is interesting because we're kind of seeing two competing forces that are trying to outpace one another. I would argue that statistically right now, the data is outpacing the ability to automate. And so that goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is the insertion of the right automation capabilities and applied to the right issues. And I think the other aspect here is what I would call an augmentation first approach. So keeping a human in the loop to understand and decipher where the quality control is going right or wrong, understanding exactly what problem sets need to be addressed most rapidly by automation, where we can help them out. And that again bridges back to some of the previous notes in this conversation about some of those soft skill liaisons that need to be there. Ravi talked about developers embedded with the team, 100%. Nothing can be built in a vacuum anymore. These top-down mandates of technology have repeatedly failed in most organizations. So yeah, I think if we figure out how best to augment the analytic workflows as they exist today, then we're going to be able to figure out how to actually compete with the vast amounts of data coming in the right ways, rather than just trying to take a one-size-fits-all approach.
And that's great. Ravi, put a cherry on the top of this conversation with us. It takes a village here. What does true collaboration look like? And I'm talking developers, analysts, like we were talking about before, but also private and public sector. From a strategy standpoint, how do you bring all those different stakeholders together effectively?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, it's just about creating that open community, right? So a lot of things right now are, coming out of vendors are siloed, they're proprietary, everything is close holds to the chest. I think we really need to start looking at, how do we open those things up and how do we share that knowledge between different technologies, different people, different companies to really just push the innovation forward and ultimately help out our end users. And we've seen that in the commercial area as well, right? Where, companies like your Facebooks and your Googles are actually, open sourcing the technology and say, hey, we developed this new model, go ahead and use it, right? We want to democratize that technology. So everyone use it. And at the end of the day, things get better and better. So, data sharing, knowledge sharing is going to be huge, right? Fusing that collective knowledge together, I think, is going to be the way to move things forward. And that's not just between the developer groups, but fusing that end user analyst knowledge as well, getting that all working together in a very streamlined, efficient manner to eventually just kind of create products and technology that works the best for the users.
Great place to end it. Ravi Boudou, thanks for bringing that to a close for us, sir. Great to have you.
Thank you.
And Nick Bousquet, always a pleasure. Thanks for being here, sir. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks very much, George.
Let's send our audience on to the next session on insider threats. For GovExec, I'm George Jackson. See you next time.